Thank you, everyone, for joining us on Ortelius Beaming Ortelius podcast. And let me introduce you what Ortelius is. Ortelius is help you build some of the microservices by providing you a central catalog for services. With their deployment specs, applications teams can easily consume and deploy services across cluster. Ortelius track application version based on service updates and map their service dependency, eliminating confusion and guesswork. So, some small intro of the Ortelius, and now we are talking about on this episode GitOps, and we have not a better guest than Victor Farsek. Thank you very much, Victor, for joining us.
Hey, good to be here again.
Yes, absolutely. So, just a quick introduction of yours to people who are listening to us on the podcast.
I'm Victor.
Oh, wow. That's great.
I don't know, man. I don't know. I do a bunch of things, different things.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Victor is a developer advocate at Upbound, and he has a wonderful YouTube channel. Always try to share his wonderful work with the community, and a great human being. And I just asked him, I want to have some show with you, and he's absolutely ready to do it. So today, our agenda is GitOps, and people who had never heard about GitOps, let people know what it is and why we are so crazy about GitOps.
So there are two different things that I believe that might need explanation. First is what it really is, and then there are principles which are, I think, very important, because if you just talk about what it is, then you might think that many tools are doing GitOps even if they're not, right? So what it is relatively easy to explain, and that's that we have two states. Desired state, that's what I want. As a human being, as Victor, kind of like, that's the expression of my desire. And we have the actual state, that's what something really is, right? So it's what it should be and what it is. And what it should be is defined one way or another as something that is readable by machines, stored in Git. That's where we store things. It doesn't have to be in Git, to be honest. It can be SVN, it can be database, but stored somewhere. And then we have, and then the actual state, let's say AWS resources or Kubernetes applications or databases or whatever it is, needs to somehow become, get into the same state as the desired state, is what I defined myself. So GitOps is all about converging the actual state into the desired state. This is what I want, and it needs to be this, and what it is must be the same as what I want. Now, that being said, there are 4 principles, because according to that definition, what I just said, you can say, hey, if I use Circle CI or Jenkins or GitLab CI or any of those things, I'm doing GitOps, right? Because I push something to Git, and then those pipelines do something, and then all of a sudden, my actual state is as I want, right? According to that, what I just said. And that's why the principles are extremely important, right? And there are 4 principles that any tool needs to implement in order to be called GitOps, right? And by the way, I didn't mention before, but there are tools in between the actual and desired state that are making this happen. It's not little people sitting around and waiting, doing our biddings. So, 4 principles, right? Needs to be declarative, meaning that the desired state needs to be expressed declaratively. Now, just to clarify before I continue, what I'm saying does not necessarily mean that that's the best way to do stuff. I'm just saying that that's how something should be done to be called GitOps. That does not mean that you need to define declaratively. You don't have to use GitOps, right? So, declarative definition of the desired state, it needs to be versioned and immutable. So you cannot just keep it on a disk drive, right? That's why I said Git. Git is the most common way how we version things and how we make something immutable, meaning you cannot really edit a commit. You can create a new commit, you cannot edit it. And now comes the important thing that distinguishes GitOps tools from pipelines. It needs to be pulled automatically. And that means that you cannot have, hey, I push something to Git and then I run GitLab CI because GitHub is going to notify it. That's push mechanism, right? It needs to be pulled. So I must have a process somewhere that is constantly monitoring my Git repository. And whenever there is a change in between what it is and what it should be, does whatever needs to be done. So pulled automatically third. And the fourth one, continuously reconciled. And this is now important. Even if I ignore pulled automatically, it's not good enough to say, hey, whenever I change something in Git, I will run some process, and that process will do whatever needs to be done. No, because that actual state might change because a server might go down for random reasons, right? So, and then if it goes down, it will stay down forever until I make a change to Git. That's why it needs to be continuously reconciled. We need to have a process that is all the time watching for the differences. Not only when I push something to Git, but all the time monitoring and saying, is this the same as this? Yes. Is this the same as this? Yes. Is this the same as this? No. Oh, okay, stop. I need to do something, right? So declarative, version then immutable, pulled automatically, continuously reconciled. If you do those four things, you're doing GitOps.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. That's a great way of thinking about GitOps because it's not really complicated at the first go. But it really is like you have YAML files that you have in your machine. And Kubernetes is all about YAML. You have ingress for YAML, you have services for YAML, you have deployment, replica, everything is YAML based. And when you put this YAML into the GitHub repository, their job is actually to make the system to the desired state. You want two replicas, you want to have ingress install on that application, and you want to have the self-healing, like some of the pods go down, it's automatically stayed up. And one of the best things that you draw during the conversation is reconciling. So I think that is, I think, the main part of the GitOps. So tell us about what reconciling is, and also there are some people who are relatively new. What is imperative and declarative approach in general in IT?
I'll answer those questions, but before I do that, a small correction of what you said. I intentionally did not say Kubernetes, you did. And I'm intentionally avoiding to say Kubernetes because nothing says that we should apply GitOps principles only for applications running Kubernetes. It could be for anything. Okay, so now I already forgot your questions. What is reconcile? What does it mean being reconciled, right?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
Now I'm going to actually use Kubernetes example, right? When you deploy a deployment in Kubernetes, you're telling Kubernetes, I want this deployment. And as a result of, and you say, I want this deployment and I want to have 2 replicas of my application, right? I'm not talking about GitOps for now, right? What Kubernetes does is 2 things. First, it will create 2 pods so that you have 2 replicas of your application. But, and this is now kind of where reconciliation comes into, it does not only create those 2 pods. First, it checks how many pods do you have? 0, 1, 3, right? It might create 2, it might create 1, it might destroy a pod, right? And it is continuously watching the status. It's not only doing something once. It is, you're making a contract, like with a signature, kind of saying, I told you 2 pods. I told you 2 replicas, and I want you to ensure that it's always 2 replicas no matter what happens, right? And that's reconciliation. I mean, not directly, but basically reconciliation is about looking for drifts. Drifts means the differences between what I want and what there is. If they're not the same, then there is a drift. Like, hey, this tiny thing is different than what you said. And when it finds drifts, it reconciles, meaning that it is eliminating those drifts, those differences, by reconciling those 2 states. That's what Kubernetes does. And that's one of the reasons why all the GitOps tools worth using today are in Kubernetes, because Kubernetes already has half of the work for GitOps tools done. So reconciliation is removing the drifts, and drifts are differences between 2 states. And you asked me a second question, but I forgot what it was.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And that is actually based on that reconciliation. We talk about a lot in Kubernetes word declaratively. And for the people who are really new to this word, what does you mean? Because we have two way of doing things in IT in general. Like one is imperatively and one is declaratively. And I want you to people know what that two different mean. And that is based on the conversation we have, like reconciliation and drift detection.
Yes. So for Kubernetes to know, for Kubernetes or GitOps tools or many other types of tools, to know easily what you want, it's actually not to know. It's much easier for them to know what you want if you declared every single piece of what that is, right? It's much easier for Kubernetes to understand what you want when you say, I want 3 replicas, and I want this host, and I want this, and I want that, right? Declaring each parameter of something and each component separately, right? Imperative would be basically, using programming languages, saying, hey, I have some if-else statements, and I have loops, and I have all the things that we do when we write real code, whatever that means. Actually, everything is real code, but application code. So imperative is more about creating the logic of something, and declarative is about exactly specifying what you want. And that's very important because that makes job of Kubernetes easy, right? Now, you can have both, to clarify. So you can use something like templating. Some people say that Helm is declarative. I beg to differ. I say that Helm is actually imperative. Or Python code or Go code, you don't have to do it declaratively. However, you can specify any way you want, but between you doing something and that reaching Kubernetes or GitOps tools, it needs to be transformed into declarative, right? So you have 2 options. Either you write directly YAML or JSON or XML or any of the declarative ways to define things directly, or you can use some other tools. You can use, like, let's say, Pulumi. But for Pulumi to do what needs to be done, Pulumi then needs to transform what you did into a declarative format. And then it can be used by GitOps, by Kubernetes, and many other tools. So how you get to have declarative is up to you, but it needs to be declared one way or another at the end of the day.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Like, I think that the one way you do manually some of the stuff, and you tell the system that I want my system to have in that stage that I have defined in YAML. I don't know how you do it. Let's do it. You know how to do it. So that's the way to do it. And apparently you're telling each step, like, you've done this script, you've done this, when load balancer, you've done this thing. So I think that's a great explanation to this. I think that's a really, really new, everybody listening to this, actually they heard about a lot, declaratively, imperatively.
Yeah, kind of like, the example would be, and I'm using this example simply because that's what I was doing an hour ago, right? Example from my life an hour ago. I was doing homework with my daughter, right? At one moment I told her, do the homework. That's about it. Very clear, concise. That's what needs to be done, right? I did not go and say, hey, do this and then do that and loop through it and stuff like that. It needs to have very clear instructions what should be done. That's declarative, right?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And also, I think for those of people, might be some of the people who join it or listening to us, has a DevOps background, like they spend most of the career in the DevOps, and they heard the new term called GitOps, and they're wondering, is it a subset of DevOps, or is it a completely new field, or how do I map my existing knowledge of DevOps into the GitOps?
So I still don't know what DevOps is, to begin with. DevOps is everything. Whatever you ask somebody, is this DevOps? Yes, absolutely everything, right? So DevOps is a maybe a process. It's a cultural change and stuff like that, right? Well, it's something very fluid, hard to define. GitOps is a technical practice, right? So DevOps is not a technical practice. It's not kind of like you do this and then you're DevOps. No, kind of like developers and operations work together, blah, 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 blah. Like Agile. Conceptually, it's not the same thing, but it goes into the same category as you say Agile. Agile is not a technical practice, right? XP is. The same thing with GitOps. GitOps is a technical practice. This is what needs to be done. This is how that something is done. And those are the tools that fulfill the requirements to do things in a very, very specific way. Right? So technical DevOps is, I still don't know what it is, but it's not a technical term for sure.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And I think, as you mentioned, like one is a kind of a specification, like you should do these kind of thing in the DevOps world, and there are plethora of tools, and this is totally up to you. How do you implement those things? And the GitOps is actually a technical term, and this is your problem you have, and this is how you technically solve that problem. And now we're talking about the GitOps, so people are really listening to us and new. Tell us about the workflow, because that's really important for people to understand from the Victor wise, like what the workflow it is. Like when we develop code and when you commit the first repository, first hit commit to the repository, what happened next in the GitOps pipeline? How should you build it, and what the process look like?
So, I will actually give you two answers to that. Actually, only one answer to what you asked, but then say that you asked the wrong question. So, GitOps process is very easy. You push some change to Git that modifies the desired state. There is a process running somewhere that detects that and makes the changes to the system and continues monitoring the system. There is not much more to it. Or to put it in other words, you change YAML or JSON or whatever file, you push it to Git, and that's the whole process. There is nothing else to it, right? I mean, from the human perspective, from process perspective, we have some operator kind of that is monitoring it, sees, oh, Victor wants a new change the desired state, I should do something. Now, what is a more interesting question, which you didn't ask, from my perspective, is how does GitOps fit into continuous delivery or continuous integration or continuous deployment process, right? To me, that's a more interesting question. Now, if you forget about GitOps, imagine that it doesn't exist, kind of how we did in the past. So if you talk about CI/CD, let's say CD, continuous delivery, right? Continuous delivery is a full automation of the life cycle of an application. And what that really means is that it starts with Git. I push some change to Git. And now bear in mind, when I say change, I do not necessarily mean change to the state of my system. It could be change to my Python code. Doesn't matter. I push something to Git. I typically run a pipeline that would build, test, deploy, and so on and so forth. What it does depends from one case to another, but let's say in a simple way, build, test, deploy, right? Now, in that world, the deployment build would be, okay, I execute like from inside pipeline, not me, right? In a pipeline, I would execute something similar to Docker image build. Test, I would execute some Maven tests or whatever you're using. And deployment would be kubectl apply, right? Or Helm install, or SSH over there and copy the file, whatever the deployment process is. Now, if you put GitOps into the mix, the situation changes a bit. And it changes if I still continue with those three steps, right? I build, stays the same. I test, stays the same. And then when it comes to deployment, instead of deploying directly from the pipeline, that pipeline is not going to deploy anything. That pipeline is going to get the contents of the repository that contains my manifest, modify something, let's say change the tag of the image of the application, and push it back to Git. So my pipelines all of a sudden do not deploy anything. They are modifying Git repositories. It doesn't have to be pipeline. We have other ways to do that, but let's say pipeline for the argument, right? And then pipeline, from pipeline perspective, it's finished, but the process perspective is not finished, right? After my pipeline is finished, then we have like Flux or Argo CD that will detect that change, apply it to the cluster or AWS or wherever you're running, right? So from the high level perspective, it's still the same. We build, we test, we'll deploy, but the way how we deploy is different. We do not deploy directly. We make changes to Git. And the reasons why we want to do that, actually, I forgot about the most important thing to say, right? Why do we want GitOps in the first place? And the reason is that I want to be able to have information at any given moment what is supposed to be the state of my system. If we just execute kubectl apply, doesn't matter whether I do it from my laptop or I do it from pipelines, then kind of like nobody knows what is the state that you want to have. And I don't mean on that release, but the state is the kind of everything. So we want to track those things, and that's why the whole story about GitOps, right?
Yes, absolutely. And you, I think you get my question, because the next question actually on the CI/CD, like how it's different.
I get you, man.
And you already answered that. That's awesome. So now we kickstart the moving forward, because we already you talk about like Argo CD and Flux. You talked during the conversation, and for the people, we talk about GitOps. We know what it is and how it detects a drift detection and how it's different for the current CI/CD pipeline. But now the current implementation we have, like in Argo CD and Flux. So tell us, the people, what these tools are doing and how they actually you get started with these tools as well.
So what they're doing is relatively easy to explain. It's not necessarily that what they're doing is easy. It's not. But to explain it is relatively easy. You have a process running somewhere in Kubernetes cluster, right? It doesn't have to be in Kubernetes cluster, but all the tools happen to be in Kubernetes because most of the innovation is happening in Kubernetes. So we have a process running in Kubernetes, and all we're doing is telling Flux of Argo CD, hey, here's an application. And by application, I do not mean necessarily the same thing as application. I mean, here's a entity. Let's say entity. Here's an entity that I want you to manage. And that entity, or entities in plural, are defined in this repository. So we are feeding Argo CD or Flux with information, two types of information. First, these are the repositories you should watch. And the second thing is, those are the destinations where that something should be happening, right? Kind of, hey, inside of whatever is defined in that repository should run inside of this cluster. Or it doesn't have to be application, right? It should be something running in AWS, right? Or in Azure or whatever. So source, desired state, Git. Destination could be provider like Azure. So we just feed it that information, and that's about it, right? And then it's up to those tools to figure out what you have in those repositories and how different that is from what is in the destination locations.
Yes, absolutely. So you have a source, like you tell, this is where my code is living, and this is my desired destination is. I want my system to look like this at any moment of time. And
always, forever.
And this is your job, is actually to make that system into that state. I don't
Correct.
know how you tell it, how you make it happen. It's totally the job of yours. Now do that. So it's I
not
think
my problem.
Yes, absolutely. It's now the life is really easy. Explanation is really easy. But how these system like Argo CD, Flux, because in the Kubernetes landscape, there is always debates about what should we do, because there is so many options you have. And I think in the GitOps world, there are so many, might be there are few many, but I'll talk about a lot Argo CD and Flux. So now we talk about what the difference is, and it is different to understand what is better, but it's different to how it's actually different from each other.
So let's say that there are three tools that are worth considering: Argo CD, Flux, and newcomer Rancher Fleet. Everything else is either doesn't exist, or it's not GitOps, or it's too young. Now, I'm going to ignore Rancher Fleet for a second, right? The way how I like to describe the differences between Argo CD and and the Flux is like the situation after the Second World War, during Cold War, right? So what was happening during Cold War? Russia and US, Eastern and Western blocs. Whenever somebody increases the number of missiles, the other side does the same, right? And that was
Yes,
kind of like, so kind of, it was a race where the moment one side goes in front, the other side would catch up, right? And it's something similar with Argo CD and Flux. Now, of course, there are differences, really. But for ignoring now slightly different way to define things, manifests, they are more or less the same, right? I mean, there are differences, just to clarify. I'm not saying that they're exactly the same. But from user perspective, 95% or 90% of what they do is really the same. The major big difference, I think, if I would have to specify one big difference, is that Argo CD has a web UI and Flux doesn't. Free option. I'm talking about open source, ignoring enterprise version. But apart from that, choose either of the two. Throw a coin, kind of heads, tail, and choose one of the
yes,
two.
yes, absolutely, absolutely. And also, if you are still new and don't know which one to use, the Victor has a wonderful YouTube channel, and I think ton of videos on GitOps and Flux will tell you in which scenario you should use that. Go check that out as well. And if you're not subscribing to the Victor channel, I think you're not in the cloud native world. You should be. It's been a
I'll,
wonderful YouTube.
if you're not subscribed, I will find you
Yes.
and punish you. I
Yes,
know who you are. I know who you are. I know you, eh?
yes, absolutely, absolutely. Go check. It's a wonderful place because always you see very new terminologies, new concepts, new tools. The only channel I have where I can see all the new details around the things I never heard about it, and Victor explained wonderfully well in a very short format in this app. And we talk about Flux, Argo CD. Now, as you term the coin, like when you start another conversation, but before we're moving to that, talk about some Rancher fleet because I think it's been in this stage now that we can talk about it. It's had some
Yes.
good applications.
Yeah, so what makes Rancher Fleet special is that it was designed to run at scale. Or not to run at scale, sorry, that's not correct. It was designed to manage your state at scale, right? So from design perspective, it was made from get-go to effectively manage applications running in dozens or hundreds of clusters, right? And hundreds or thousands of applications, stuff like that. So at scale. Now, that's design, right? That's what makes it special. We're designed to run at scale. Now, do not misunderstand what I'm saying, because I'm in no way saying that Argo CD or Flux do not manage applications and resources at scale. They do. But they were not designed from day one to do that, right? So I would consider Rancher Fleet if you want to run your stuff at scale, big one, right? But only consider it. Do not use it. It's still young. A lot of problems and a lot of issues there, which is normal because we are talking about a project that is infancy. But I think it's a project that is very interesting to watch. Not necessarily to recommend yet, but to watch.
Yes, absolutely. I think you have to reconcile with the Rancher fleet. What they are doing in their repository might be some interest for you. I think you go check out it as well. I think the Rancher is really a wonderful team because they spun up very good projects like K3S, like I think, and also Rancher Fleet, Rancher Desktop is also coming up. There are storage solutions. So I think you can expect great things from that team because they already make their presence felt in the industry. So we can expect some good things, good innovation happening in that space as well. So before jumping into the theory where we talk about, like in your YouTube videos, you talk about on the first, this is how you should do it. You talk about their pros, you talk about how to implement it, and the last part is actually a wonderful comparison. So we will start that comparison later. What thing you should not do in the GitOps as well. So talk us about some cloud scenarios, and also the scenarios where Kubernetes is not there, and people think, because it is a really like you. When you talk about GitOps, I think most of the audience think it's just for the Kubernetes. But you always telling people it's not just for Kubernetes. You can do things outside Kubernetes equally well. So talk us about your thoughts on this.
So let me start by saying that, and this is not, most people do not think this way. So I think that I'm still in minority, but I do not see primarily a Kubernetes primary function being, hey, I can run your applications as containers on some servers, right? To me, that's not the first thing that I think of today when I think of Kubernetes. I think about API. I think about it being extensible through custom resource definition. I think about the ability to detect drifts and reconcile, right? So, and then maybe some of the things it will also run its Kubernetes directly, like containers. Some things it might not, right? But the important part here is extensibility, right? Kubernetes is not supposed to be something that you take and you use. That's not the purpose of Kubernetes. Kubernetes is just a set of building blocks that other vendors should use to assemble a platform, or you can use to assemble a platform. You take different pieces and you have a platform, right? Now, if you think of Kubernetes not as something that runs your containers, but as a way to create a platform that has certain capabilities like extensible API, custom resource definitions, reconciliation, so on and so forth, then I will confidently say that almost everybody will at one moment be using Kubernetes, even though not everybody will be running their applications in Kubernetes. Right? Which is probably not what most people think about when they think Kubernetes. And the reason I'm saying that is, let's say GitOps, and I have many other examples we can talk about, right? So for me to run GitOps process, I need to run it in Kubernetes simply because all the tools for GitOps are designed to run in Kubernetes, right? But that does not mean that, for GitOps to run, for that GitOps process to work, it needs to get those manifests that are defined as Kubernetes resources from Git and then apply it to cluster. And here comes the important part. That manifest that you stored in Git might be describing a database running somewhere else, right? It could be RDS database in AWS. It could be whatever in Google. It could be Elastic, right? So what those tools do is, hey, this is what is in Git. I'm going to tell Kubernetes to apply it. And then Kubernetes uses something called controllers that say, hey, for something called Victor, I'm inventing now, there is an associated controller, and that controller does something. And that something can be I run a container, or I run a database outside of the cluster, or I create a cluster, or I create a server. It can be anything. Controllers can be literally anything. And that's where we are going. We are going towards the world in which Kubernetes orchestrates everything. Not only containers running. So think of Kubernetes as like orchestrator, like in orchestra, right? You go there, you go there, you do this, you do that, right? It's orchestrator of everything, not only applications running Kubernetes, right? And kind of that happens to be the project where I work with Crossplane, but that would be a separate subject, I guess.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. We definitely covered that in the future episode as well. That's a very good topic to discuss. But I think it's really difficult to understand what the Victor is telling at this moment of time for the beginners like me. but I will accept the all the things that Victor said, because his history of telling the stories is actually popping up. So you can see, you might see GitOps are outside Kubernetes in near future as well. Because as he mentioned with the conversation, there are controllers in Kubernetes. Some functionality is missing in Kubernetes, but you can implement those functionality in Kubernetes using those controllers. And these controller previously you just build your own one, but now we have tools available for us. They can have some controllers and they can give you all these kind of flexibilities.
Here's a good example for you. So you used Ingress, right?
Yes.
What does Ingress do?
It's just route the application to like you go there in that pod, or you go that in that pod. Is how I
No,
look at the Ingress
not really. That's what services do.
services. So like
Yeah. So what Ingress does, I mean, does few things, but the primary function is to create an external load balancer outside of the
yes,
cluster. So think about it for a second, right?
yes,
Nothing
absolutely.
to do with what is happening in your cluster. I mean, it has something to do with your cluster, but very little. What Ingress does, and kind of people have been using, is actually managing resource
Yes,
outside of the cluster. Or when you create a persistent volume, right? What does persistent volume do in your cluster? Not much. The primary function of persistent volume is to get a disk from outside of the cluster and attach it to your containers, right? So we already saw since the very beginning of Kubernetes, we saw examples of Kubernetes doing things that are not really containers directly related, but outside of the cluster. Ooh, external load balancer. Ooh, disk, like storage somewhere else. It's just that at the very beginning, that was kind of limited to a few things. But now that kind of like we are kind of all settled into Kubernetes, now kind of it's increasing, right? More. It's like a black hole, right? What's the primary function of black holes? To swallow everything inside.
yes, absolutely. Great way to think about it. I think that's a great explanation for everyone who really new to this concept. Like Kubernetes, as is originated, doing some of the stuff that is not supposed to do, but it's actually doing, like CSI or storage interfaces, like you to talk about the network interfaces. Then we have a runtime interfaces. So they have some kind of the best practices built in. It's up to us to use those best practices and can do like the black hole stuff, do everything with Kubernetes. It's up to us. If we think about we can do everything with Kubernetes, we can do it. And if you think we not do it, that's another story. But we can do it a lot, all of the stuff that as well. So last question before we go to the pros and cons of the GitOps. So people are still deploying some of the stuff in the Azure, AWS, GCP. They're all infrastructure is already in there, and they're using most part of the AKS or EKS or GKE. That is the most, I think the audience is already there. So how those people, you tell the story like in the GitOps, you have the application running in the GitHub repositories, and your infrastructure might be living in the AKS or EKS or GKE. So for the people who want to use a GitOps in the cloud, is there are some challenging, what should you ask them, should they do it, or what the way of thinking about GitOps in the cloud like AKS, EKS, GKE scenarios?
No, there is nothing really. The only negative thing or complication, let's say, not negative, complication, is how to connect GitOps with the processes coming afterwards, right? So let's go back to the example I said about CD, right? I said we build, we test, and then we deploy, and deployment is actually modifying Git repository, and then the pipeline is finished, and Argo, CD, or Flux will synchronize stuff, right? Now let me change that scenario for a bit. Let's say that we build and then deploy and test afterwards, right? So our building and testing is happening with pipelines, but deployment in the middle is happening with different tools, right? And that's all asynchronous. meaning that my pipeline does not know when Argo CD will synchronize. It might happen immediately. It might happen a minute later, right? So how do I bridge that gap? That's the question, or a big problem, not problem, but challenge that we have today. If I build something and then I make changes to Git and I don't know when Argo CD will do the stuff, how do I know two things? First, when to run tests or whatever I do after deployments. So when do I do that? And second, a second question is, how do I do it? Because I cannot use the same pipeline build because there is a gap, there is a hole in between, right? And the answer to that, which is not yet answered by industry, I believe, but we are getting there, is in abandoning the idea of monolithic approach to our processes, including pipelines. So instead of thinking, I don't know, have you used Jenkins, for example, or any of, okay, Jenkins, right? When we use Jenkins, and that applies to all the tools, all the pipelines, right, or almost all. The way how we do it is that we define a pipeline. Now you do this, now you do that, like build, test, deploy, blah, 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 blah. Where we will be going is breaking that into tiny things, actions that are executed as a result of events, right? So instead of thinking in terms, I do this and now I do that and now I do this and stuff like that, and we cannot do that with GitOps because it is breaking that conceptually. We need to think about when this happens, I do this. And when that happens, I do that. And when this happens, I do something else. So let me explain with example. Let me break that simple pipeline into, whenever I push something to Git, that's an event that results in notifying something to build, let's say, container image. And then I'm finished, right? And then some other, instead of me continuing with the pipeline, then I have a different process that is monitoring my registry, container image registry, and saying, oh, whenever somebody pushes something there, I should update my Git repository manifests. And then it stops. And then you have a third process that says, hey, whenever somebody updates the manifest, I should synchronize the state, GitOps. And then you have a fourth process that says, hey, whenever somebody changes the deployment in a Kubernetes cluster, I should run tests. So instead of thinking in terms of everything defined as one huge monolithic blah, 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 we think in small reusable pieces that are triggered depending on what happened where. All based on events.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
Did I complicate your picture out too much or something?
No, it's totally makes sense for me. But people might be really new to the GitOps. These terminologies might be new for them. But luckily, we have a YouTube channel that's called DevOps Toolkit, and that's built for that purpose, to make this misconception clear. So I will tell you, because this podcast also is for the listener-only mode as well. So DevOps Toolkit, you subscribe, I think you will land into the Witkit channel as well. So I think if that's misleading, because what you tell, I think that's really makes sense for me, because Argo has Argo rollouts, rollbacks, Argo has Argo workflows, Argo events. So Argo has all those things. It's up to us to use those things and solve new challenges.
I like that you mentioned Argo rollouts, because I think that might better explain the challenge, right? So if you think about the process in terms of I do A, B, C, D, then park that for a second, and now let's talk about canary deployments, right? Deployment is not just I put this here. Deployment is a process that says I will send a bit of traffic to the new release, majority of traffic to the old release, and then I'm going to monitor how people react. And if they like it, if there are no errors, I will increase the reach of the new release. gradually and decrease the number of requests going to the old release. Now, the reason why I'm saying all that is that you cannot declaratively decide what you will do after the deployment, because if you're doing canary releases, you do not know when it will end. You cannot define in advance when you will do something after that, because you do not know when it will finish. Right?
Yes.
And even if you do know when it will finish, you do not know whether it will finish successfully or it will roll back.
Yes.
So you cannot decide in advance what you will do and when you will do it, because you do not know when or what will happen. You have just different events that are happening. At some moment in the future, Argo rollouts will say finish successfully, or at some time in the future, it will say I rolled back. Or it will say, you know what, I'm hanging in the middle of the process for whatever reason, right? So you cannot predict what will happen, but what you can do is to be prepared to react to different situations. Hey, whenever Argo rollouts tells me that it did X, I should do this. Whenever it tells me, and I will do that by listening to it. This is now important. This is like humans. You do not do stuff randomly, right? You listen to what somebody is telling you and then reacting to that something, right? You do not know what I will say in advance. But if you listen to what I'm saying, then you can make a decision what to do depending on what I said.
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
And that's how events work. Different processes are all listening for stuff. And then there is a message saying this happened or that happened. And then you decide, I will do something or I will do nothing, right?
Yes. And I think that's a wonderful conversation. Like, you don't know what actually is happening, but you can prepare yourself. If something happen, you can do this thing. That is actually viable for all of the scenarios. And all of that, I think the cloud native, if you look at the cloud native landscape, there are some tools because this analogy is actually getting a lot of attraction, like tool like Dapper, Knative, or other tools. They are always based on the eventing model. So I think we see a lot of the attraction going on this landscape. So we are approaching a closer. Love talking to you, because I don't want to finish these conversation, because I love talking to you. But we are approaching an hour. So one of the final question before we go to the pros and cons is, we see a lot of the GitOps as a service. Like, we see some of the people give you some of the things like, this is a SaaS platform. This is GitOps. You should use it. Everything is done by yours on behalf of ours. So how you look at the GitHub, I will see the code fresh, and there are some other people investing time and energy to give you the GitOps as a managed service. So what are your thoughts on that?
The question is, what are my thoughts on managed services, generally speaking, and that includes GitOps. I think I love managed services. And I think it's important that we are all moving to managed services, and the reason is very simple. I'm having some business, whatever the business is. I'm having some objectives, right? And what I want to do in my business is to focus on my business, right? And I want to use services for everything else. Now, what that is depends on what your business is, right? But if my business is not to run servers, I don't want to run servers myself. Because if I do that, then I'm not focusing on what my business is, right? And the same thing for almost anything else. CI/CD as tools as a service, GitOps tools as a service, everything as a service is great, because it enables somebody to be focused on providing that service, while everybody else can focus on whatever is their business. Right? That's why I like cloud. That's why I like services, because it allows me to offload things that I was about to say do not matter. They matter, but they're not my core business. Right? You have no business benefit from managing Argo CD, right?
Absolutely.
It's necessary. We need it because it enables some other things that we do, but itself is the same like its servers. Kind of like nobody earns money. I mean, some people do earn money from running servers, but majority of us, our customers are not paying us to run servers. They're paying us to give them certain service, certain whatever we're giving them. So everything that is not my core business as SaaS.
Yes, absolutely. I'm totally agree with you. Like you need to invest a lot of the time and energy, the things you are doing, because that needs some critical stuff. Like you're doing Scrum calls every day, telling about how to set up the GitOps pipeline, how to do this, how to do that, but you are missing conversation about what the core business your look like. And when you have tools available, you should use that. Like you can't use Kubernetes by yourself. You use AKS, EKS, GK. That's perfectly fine, because in that way you lift off the burden of understanding the Kubernetes, and you will understand. You will invest more time and energy what is running in on top of the Kubernetes, because that's important to you and that is actually your domain, and you need to invest time on that. I'm absolutely agree with you on this note as well, and hope what people are listening to us talk about this. And before, as we are also the in the Ortelius project, we are investing a lot of the time in the Argo CD tooling or the GitOps tooling, and we have the open source community. People are watching this podcast or listening to us. Join us in the Ortelius.io. You see the Discord channel available for us. We can hang out, ask them questions, and we hope to see some videos on the Ortelius side and the Victor channel as well. I hope Victor can look at the repository afterward in the Ortelius and check what we are things doing in the microservices world, and tell us about what we think what we go wrong in there, and we need to rectify those things as well. So it's up to the Victor as well. So go check out repository as well. So we're a very good contributor for the different part. We have a very diverse open source community. We have folks from the Chile, South Africa, Pakistan, India, Australia, New Zealand, and I think some from various other countries. A diverse open source community, as of I know. So I think you should go explore these of the Ortelius content as well. And before I let you go, we have 2 or 3 minutes more available for us to hang out. And this is up to the Victor. Tell us what good and what bad in the GitOps.
I've the major problem with Git, there is nothing. I cannot think of a bad thing, except that it's relatively new, so that many other things in a system are not necessarily prepared for that. Like the pipelines I mentioned before, right? They're not necessarily prepared for that shift of thinking, right? And so if there are problems, there's more lack of tooling and lack of support, right? We mentioned canary deployments, right? If you use Flagger or Argo rollouts, and both of them are coming from the family of projects that include GitOps, right? They're not GitOps tools. But when they roll back, they're not rolling back in a GitOps friendly way, right? They just roll back instead of pushing stuff to Git and then letting Argo CD or Flux do it. So, and that's only due to time required for us to adopt the system there. But I think that eventually it's not even about GitOps. I think it's more about us moving towards event-based everything, and GitOps being just very good fit into that.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Thank you very much, Victor, to being on the show as well. I always learned a lot. This is, I think, I done your episode previously on my channel, Cloud Native FM. Today we're doing the Beaming Ortelius podcast. So everybody who listening to us, we have a website you can listen or download the podcast is available. I hope you checked out as well. And there was one of the I've talked to 40 plus guests for a year for doing the podcast, and talking to Victor is always feel I don't want to end the conversation. I want to talk about all day all night these concepts, because I learned so many new stuff with it. And Go check that out. If you're not, we are not be friend anymore, because DevOps Toolkit is a wonderful channel. 24K subscribers. They tell you the people are going to this channel and learning about new things from Victor Farsik. It's been a wonderful way explaining these concepts. And if you're listening to us, not watching us, so DevOps, DevOpstoolkit. This is a Victor YouTube channel, and you should join in. And these are all the details that we covered in this podcast. It's all very available as a hands-on material for you. Go check that out. It's been a wonderful show for everyone. And we hope to see again Victor. There are some various other topics Victor can talk about it, but we hope to see another episode with a Victor as well. And also join us if you're enthusiastic about contributing to the open source, contributing to the microservices, or you wanted to get your hand dirty, or you wanted to be a part of the community, or are diving effort into the on the microservices. So Ortelius is one that community. We have a very good folks from the different part of the world, and you should explore that. github.com/Ortelius. Ortelius is our repository, and if you want to contribute or want to get started with it, join the Discord server, and we will be there to help you on board with the process. So thank you very much, Victor. Hope to see you again in the future, and hope to see some of the.
You're gonna see me in a month.
Yes, absolutely. And KubeCon Valencia. Absolutely, absolutely. And everybody who join who is going to KubeCon, I think you should meet Victor. He's a wonderful human being, always talking to you in a very good manner. You always enjoy the talk with him. Thanks, Victor. Won't spend most time with you. You're a busy person, done very hard work for the YouTube and all the on the job side as well. So hope to see you again in the future. Stay safe, stay healthy. Bye bye, everyone.